They saw a black woman with a phone, not a decorated leader on duty, and in their ignorance they made a choice that would shatter their careers. It was supposed to be a quiet drive through a sleepy Louisiana town. Brigadier General Alessia Grant, dressed casually in jeans and a plain jacket, had pulled into a rundown fuel stop to take a secure call from the Pentagon. No uniform, no flashing credentials, just another traveler passing through. But for Alicia, time was critical. She was en route to Barksdale Air Force Base for a high-level classified briefing. When her signal dropped, she stopped briefly to reconnect. That decision, seemingly innocent, was all it took for bias to flare. Inside the shop, a local clerk watched her from behind the till. To her, Alicia wasn't a leader or a strategist. She was a suspicious black woman on a phone, and that was enough to call the police. The rest escalated in minutes. What struck so many viewers was not just the injustice. It was Alicia's silence, her discipline, and her unwavering calm under pressure. As Yuma Black Stories commented, her calmness under pressure says more than 1,000 words. She didn't just win, she inspired. That calm defiance, grounded in dignity and truth, revealed not only her character, but how deeply broken the assumptions around her were. In that moment, Alicia didn't raise her voice. She didn't run. She didn't beg. She simply stood her ground and let the weight of her truth speak louder than their authority. And when she finally made one call, one connection back to the Pentagon, the tide turned, because what they didn't realize was that the woman they tried to humiliate wasn't just another driver. She was the system they thought they controlled. And now, the whole country was watching. It only took a glance and a snap judgment for everything to unravel. General Alicia Grant, moments before a critical security briefing, had pulled into a dusty forecourt in Mosswood, Louisiana. She stood near her rental car, speaking softly into a secure line with the Pentagon, blending in intentionally with the casual look of jeans, a jacket, and a baseball cap pulled low. But for one woman watching from behind the counter, none of that mattered. She didn't see a military leader. She didn't hear a critical call. She saw a black woman in an unfamiliar place and called the police. No crime, no confrontation. Just a phone call in the wrong skin, at the wrong time. The response from law enforcement was swift and telling. Officers arrived with aggression in their posture and disbelief in their tone. They ignored Alicia's credentials, scoffed at her rank, and dismissed her identity as fake. As Story in Black White noted powerfully, you saw a black woman on a phone call and made a choice. That line hit like a truck. It's not just a quote. It's a mirror to how bias operates in silence. Indeed, that silent bias screamed loud that day. Alicia was handcuffed in full view of a growing crowd, her dignity bruised by ignorance wrapped in authority. Her calm composure only seemed to fuel their suspicion, because what they saw was not who she was. This moment captured something deeper than a single act of prejudice. It exposed how systemic assumptions can override truth, how uniforms and ranks can be invisible when they're worn by the wrong skin, and how dangerous it is when perception replaces evidence. And yet, as Alicia later said, they should have known better. Because the truth wasn't just in her ID, it was in her voice, her record, and the power of her silence. What they assumed was weakness was actually restraint. What they dismissed as attitude was dignity under fire. When the flashing red and blue lights lit up the petrol station forecourt, Brigadier General Alicia Grant stayed composed, but what followed stripped away more than her time. It attempted to strip her identity. Despite calmly introducing herself, showing her military credentials and federal travel orders, Alicia was met with immediate disbelief. Officer Randall Carter barely glanced at her ID before declaring it fake, throwing it aside as if her decades of service were meaningless. His partner, PC Sean Riley, stood eager, ready to escalate without cause. Alicia's calm voice and open hands didn't matter. To them, she wasn't a respected general. She was just a woman playing games. Then came the moment that would haunt every bystander. Alicia, standing firm, said clearly, "I am a general in the British Army. You are unlawfully detaining me." It didn't matter. She was shoved, handcuffed tightly enough to bruise, and pushed against her own car like a criminal. And all the while, her secure phone line to the Ministry of Defense remained open until it clattered to the tarmac, unheard by those too arrogant to listen. What Alicia endured in those minutes wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate dismissal. She was seen but not recognized, heard but not listened to. As Lord Justice Respect commented poignantly, respect, accountability, and truth will always speak louder than ignorance. That moment was the ignition point, where bias confronted truth and the uniform of power met the reality of deeper authority. The officer's refusal to verify her identity, to pause and consider that she might actually be who she claimed, is not a fluke. It's a reflection of a system that too often prioritizes control over confirmation. They didn't just ignore her credentials, they ignored her humanity. And yet Alicia didn't raise her voice. She didn't resist. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was restraint, strategic, deliberate, powerful, because she knew that one phone call, just one, would turn this roadside humiliation into a national reckoning. And it did. As General Alicia Grant stood cuffed beside her rental car, pushed roughly against the metal by two officers who refused to hear her, her voice may have been quiet, but far away, her silence had already raised alarms. Back in London, within the Ministry of Defence's secure command center, her call, still connected, though now riddled with static and chaos, had triggered emergency protocols. The moment they lost her signal, military staff shifted from concern to action. Her absence was more than unusual. It was a threat to national security. Within minutes, her exact location was traced, a remote service station on the edge of a town no one had heard of. The atmosphere in the ops room turned electric. "Get Barksworth Military Police on the line, now," barked the colonel overseeing the floor, "and patch me through to JAG. If something's happened to Alicia Grant, we're moving immediately." While officers Carter and Riley taunted Alicia with lines like, "You picked the wrong town," assuming she was bluffing, a convoy of blacked-out military vehicles was already speeding toward them, blue lights off, purpose sharp. What they had assumed was a game was about to become a reckoning, and when the convoy arrived, no one missed the message. Uniformed military personnel surrounded the scene with precision. Lieutenant Colonel Darren Mosley stepped out, sharp-eyed and stone-faced. The moment he addressed Alicia as General Grant, both officers' faces drained of color. "You're hereby ordered to stand down," Mosley told them. "Pending federal investigation, any further action on your part will be considered obstruction of justice." As that person was me, so sharply observed. One phone call didn't just turn the tables. It pierced through a system that thought it was untouchable. Indeed, what happened in that petrol station was more than an incident. It was an exposure. The military didn't show up with cameras. They showed up with command. And in that moment, Alicia wasn't a woman in jeans. She was power, earned, quiet, disciplined, and they had no choice but to listen. The same call they dismissed ended up being the one that destroyed their careers, and the silence that had once been used against her. It became her sharpest weapon. When the cuffs finally came off, General Alicia Grant didn't look for applause. She looked both officers in the eye and said, without raising her voice, "You're going to regret this. Not tomorrow, not next week, today." And she meant it. Because just moments later, the tires of a military convoy screamed onto the forecourt. Officers from Barksworth Air Force Base moved with disciplined urgency, no flashing blue lights, no loud declarations, just clipped orders and protective formation. Alicia didn't need to demand justice. Justice had arrived with her rank. Lieutenant Colonel Darren Mosley didn't hesitate. He saw the scene for what it was, an international embarrassment, and addressed Alicia with the respect that had been denied her just minutes earlier. "General Grant, are you injured?" She responded calmly. "Minor abrasions. The bigger injury was to their careers." At that moment, everything shifted. Officers Carter and Riley, who just minutes before had laughed at her title, now stood frozen, outnumbered, outranked, and out of excuses. "You had documentation in your hand," Mosley reminded them coldly, "and you chose to ignore it." Delaney stammered something about suspicious behavior, but Mosley shut him down with a line that would echo far beyond that forecourt. "You saw a black woman on a phone call and made a choice. That's going to follow you for the rest of your life." Row. As Story in Black-White reflected, that line's hit like a truck. It's not just a quote. It's a mirror to how bias operates in silence. Alicia didn't yell, didn't demand revenge. She simply climbed into the SUV, her posture upright, her silence now loaded with meaning. The officers hadn't just failed to see a general. They had failed to see a human being, and now the consequences were unfolding before them in real time. What had started as a small-town traffic stop was now spiraling into federal territory. The world had begun to pay attention. Videos had already gone viral. By the time the convoy pulled away, the narrative had flipped. Alicia Grant wasn't the one who'd been humiliated. They were. By the time General Alicia Grant returned to base, the battle had already moved beyond her. She hadn't even finished debriefing at Barksworth when the raw footage, grainy, unfiltered, hit the internet. A woman calmly explaining she was a senior military officer, while 2 officers manhandled and handcuffed her without cause. No yelling, no aggression, just quiet authority being crushed under blind arrogance. The video spread like wildfire. National networks picked it up within hours. Commentators, veterans, community leaders all asked the same question: how could 2 trained officers fail to recognize rank, credentials, and basic dignity? But the truth was harsher. They hadn't failed to see her status. They'd chosen not to. The public response was swift and unrelenting. Hashtags like "Justice for General Grant" and "She Wore the Stars" flooded social media. As U.S. Justice Story so powerfully stated, they saw a black woman in civilian clothes and thought she was a threat. What they didn't see was a decorated general. Shame on them, and good on her for calling higher. The Mosswood Police Department scrambled for damage control. The chief, clearly out of his depth, stammered through a press conference blaming tensions and miscommunication. But no one bought it. The press hammered them with hard questions. Why didn't your officers recognize valid military ID? Was race a factor? The silence in response said everything. Then came the deeper revelations. Internal sources confirmed both officers had histories. Complaints of excessive force and racial profiling swept under the rug. But this time, the rug had been ripped away. Civil rights lawyers launched action. The Department of Justice opened a federal inquiry. Even the governor of Louisiana weighed in, calling the incident an appalling miscarriage of justice against a national hero. As Alicia sat in quiet meetings with Pentagon officials, White House liaisons, and legal teams, she answered every question with the same composure she'd shown in the heat of that moment. But in private, the weight pressed heavier, not because she was shocked, but because after all the years, the medals, the sacrifice, none of it had mattered that day at the petrol station. Yet she knew one thing with certainty. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about everyone who had been ignored, disbelieved, and degraded for looking out of place. And now, the world was watching. By Saturday at noon, the gates outside Barksworth Air Force Base weren't just guarded by soldiers. They were surrounded by cameras, journalists, and members of a public who were no longer willing to look away. General Alicia Grant stood before them, not in plain clothes this time, but in her full dress uniform. Medals gleamed on deep navy fabric. Her posture was still, her eyes unwavering. She didn't need a slogan or a grand gesture. The uniform spoke for itself, and so did she. "I was judged," Alicia began, "not by the content of my character, not by the uniform I've earned, but by the color of my skin and the assumptions made because of it." In just a few sentences, the story stopped being personal. It became national. It echoed in the hearts of every person who had been second-guessed, sidelined, or silenced because they didn't look the part. And as Inspire Stories 2 put it so powerfully, she did not scream, did not beg, did not need to prove anything. She was quiet, calm, letting the truth and the system she had served for 29 years speak for her. Alicia didn't call for apologies. She called for accountability. Her speech wasn't a performance. It was a reckoning. And it wasn't just addressed to the media. It was a message to every silent face in the crowd. The black mothers holding signs, the veterans watching from wheelchairs, the students scribbling down her words. You matter, you're seen, and silence will not protect you anymore. She didn't flinch. She didn't soften the truth. She delivered it with the weight of every uniformed day she had ever served. Change, she said, only happens when enough people refuse to look away. In that moment, Alicia reclaimed more than her dignity. She reclaimed the narrative. And when she stepped back from the podium, the applause didn't just erupt. It rose like a tide. It was real. It was earned. Because the people in that crowd didn't just hear a general speak. They witnessed a leader rise. As General Alicia Grant stepped down from the podium, the applause still echoing in the midday heat. She didn't pick up pace or flash a smile. She walked the same way she had always done, in quiet, purposeful strides, as though the weight on her shoulders was no heavier than before, even if the eyes of a nation now followed her. What happened next wasn't a victory lap. It was a reminder. The real change doesn't happen at the microphone. It begins when the noise fades, and people start listening. Within hours, news networks looped her speech on repeat. Op-eds dissected her words. Hashtags trended. But beneath the surface, something more powerful stirred. People were reflecting. Because her story wasn't just about a general being mistreated. It was about a system that had done the same to countless others. Without the cameras, without the rank, without the rescue. As black justice. Stories wrote poignantly. They saw her skin, not her stars. One call later, their badges couldn't save them. That sentence became a lightning rod, a slogan, a mirror. It captured the exact moment arrogance collapsed in the face of quiet power. Alicia didn't pursue interviews or seek vindication in headlines. Instead, she went back to work, answering questions from investigators, offering clarity to federal officials, and more quietly, checking in on the community that had rallied behind her. She responded to injustice not with anger, but with structure, with systems, with strategy. She knew public outrage alone wouldn't dismantle bias, but accountability could. She met with civil rights attorneys, helped coordinate policy recommendations, and lent her name to initiatives far larger than herself. She didn't just expose the problem, she helped shape the response. And as the days passed, the world began to realize something. General Alicia Grant hadn't just called the Pentagon for help that day. She called the nation to attention. It wasn't the first time General Alicia Grant had stood her ground, but this time, the world stood with her. In the days following her powerful public statement, national attention turned into real momentum. Civil rights lawyers in New Orleans and Washington, D.C. filed federal complaints on her behalf. The Department of Justice launched an independent investigation, and perhaps most notably, The governor of Louisiana publicly condemned the Mosswood Police Department, calling it an appalling miscarriage of justice against a national hero. But even as the headlines swelled, Alessia remained measured. She didn't bask in media praise. She focused on the deeper message. This wasn't just about her, because behind her story stood thousands, people who had been dismissed, profiled, doubted simply because of how they looked or where they were from. As Valor Studios' stories stated with piercing clarity, this incident is a stark reminder of how deeply rooted systemic racism still is, even in institutions that are supposed to serve and protect. That truth hit home for many. Alessia's rank made her story go viral, but it was her silence, her calm, and her refusal to back down that made it universal. Her experience became a vessel for others. Victims of profiling, veterans treated like suspects, women of color who had to work twice as hard to be believed and still weren't. Inside Barksworth, Alessia worked tirelessly. She didn't just give interviews. She helped shape the internal briefings being delivered to both the Ministry of Defense and federal partners. She advocated not just for policy change, but for culture change. Behind closed doors, her voice was steady, but in private moments the weight pressed heavily, not because she feared the fight ahead, but because she had always known the fight never really ended. This wasn't about a single mistake by two officers. It was about a system that allowed those mistakes to go unchecked, until someone with stars on her shoulder and steel in her spine said, "No more." And this time, the country listened. When General Alessia Grant stepped behind the podium, the world expected a headline. What they got was a reckoning. Dressed in full uniform for the first time since the incident, Alessia stood before the cameras outside Barksworth Air Force Base, not to demand an apology, but to demand accountability. Her voice was clear, steady, and devastating in its truth. Yesterday in Mosswood, Louisiana, none of my years of service, none of my medals, none of my rank mattered. I was judged not by the content of my character, but by the color of my skin. She didn't name names. She didn't need to. Her words echoed for everyone who had ever been silenced, doubted, or dismissed. As the Silent Hope so powerfully wrote, "True authority doesn't come from uniforms or titles. It comes from courage, integrity, and the will to stand firm in the face of injustice." In that moment, Alessia wasn't just a general. She was a mirror held up to a nation, and the reflection was uncomfortable but necessary. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon we have isn't a title or a badge. It's our voice. In a world that often asks us to shrink, to stay silent, or to be grateful for less, people like Alessia remind us that dignity is non-negotiable. You don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to speak the truth, even if your voice shakes.